This is one of those things I kept to myself for years. It happened when I was around 25 or 26, long before I met my wife, long before kids, back when I still had the kind of freedom and bad judgment that only makes sense when you're young. I used to take solo backpacking trips a few times a year, usually somewhere out in the Appalachians. I'd drive to a remote trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry, usually farther than I should have, and stay out there alone for a few days with no service and no contact with anybody. I loved it. Most of my friends thought it was reckless. Looking back, they were probably right. This trip was in the Cherokee National Forest, and it permanently changed the way I look at hiking alone. I'd already been out there for 2 days, and up to that point, everything had gone exactly how I wanted. The weather had been perfect. The trail was empty, and I hadn't crossed paths with a single person since the first morning. That changed fast. Sometime in the afternoon on the second day, I noticed a wall of dark clouds building in from the west. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'd been caught in rain plenty of times before, and it usually passed without becoming a real problem. But within an hour, it was obvious this wasn't just a quick shower moving through. The wind started hitting hard, and the temperature dropped so suddenly, I stopped and put on another layer. By the time the rain finally started, I was already trying to find somewhere to wait it out. The problem was, I was in a pretty exposed section of trail, and when the rain came down, it came down all at once. Within minutes, it went from windy to violent. Smaller trees were bending sideways. I could hear limbs snapping somewhere above me in the canopy. That was the point where I stopped thinking of it as an inconvenience and started worrying about whether I was actually safe. Lightning was hitting close enough to make me flinch, and I was up at elevation with a metal-framed pack on my back, which felt like a terrible place to be. I kept moving, drenched by then, scanning both sides of the trail for anything that looked like shelter. Then, through the trees off to my left, I spotted what looked like a structure. It was dark and partly hidden by the woods, but there was no mistaking that it was man-made. When I got closer, I saw it was a tiny one-story cabin. It looked extremely old, like maybe an old hunting shack or some kind of homestead shelter that had been sitting out there for decades. There was one window on the side facing me. I can't really explain how relieved I felt when I saw it. I practically ran to it and shoved the door open. Inside it was dim, but it was dry. There wasn't much in there, just a chair, a small table, and what looked like the frame of a cot pushed against the far wall. On the right side, there was a stone fireplace packed with old ash and debris. The place smelled awful, stale, and rotten, but I didn't care. I was soaked through and freezing, and all I cared about was getting out of the storm. I stripped off my wet outer layers, dropped my pack, and lay down right there on the floor. There wasn't anywhere comfortable to sit. At that point, I wasn't thinking about exploring. I was just glad I wasn't out in the rain anymore. After maybe 10 or 15 minutes, once I'd calmed down a little, I started actually looking around. The storm was hammering the cabin so hard there wasn't much else to do, so I grabbed my flashlight and started checking the place out. That's when I realized there was more in there than I first thought. In the corner near the cot frame, there was a rolled-up sleeping bag. What stood out immediately was that it didn't look nearly as old as everything else. It wasn't new exactly, but it wasn't ancient either, and that threw me off. On the table, there were a couple of cans and some water jugs, enough to make me think somebody had been using the cabin as a kind of base camp. Maybe another hiker, maybe a hunter. Finding leftover supplies in an old place like that wasn't impossible. But the longer I looked, the more unsettled I got. Near the door, there were marks on the wall. At first, I assumed they were just wear from age, maybe damage from weather or shifting wood. But when I stepped closer and put the flashlight on them, I could see they were scratches. A lot of them. Some were light and thin. Others had been dug in much deeper. There didn't seem to be any clear pattern to them, just a mess of frantic-looking marks. I stepped back and looked at the door itself. The handle was just a basic latch, nothing unusual about that. But even with the storm going on, I opened it to look more closely at the frame. On the outside, there was a metal bracket mounted there, like it had been made to hold a padlock. It was on the outside. There was nothing on the inside that matched it, which meant if that door got locked, it could only be locked from out there. That was bad enough, but it got worse. I closed the door and turned to the only part of the cabin I hadn't checked yet, the window. I walked over and saw that the glass was still fully intact, which honestly surprised me considering how old the place looked. Then I saw why. There were screws in the frame, one in each corner, holding the window shut. Those had been put in from the outside too. Around the inside edges of the frame, there were more scratches deeper than the ones near the door. These weren't random. They looked like someone had tried desperately to force the window open with their hands. That was the moment everything came together in my head. Somebody had been kept in that cabin, not sheltered there, kept there, trapped, against their will. I should have left right then. I did think about it, but part of me convinced myself that whatever had happened there had happened a long time ago. Most of what I was seeing looked old. Even the sleeping bag, which had seemed newer than the rest of the place, was stiff and dusty when I got close to it. And more than anything, I really did not want to go back outside into that storm. So I stayed. I don't know how long I was in there after that. Maybe an hour. Maybe longer. The storm wasn't easing up at all. If anything, it seemed worse. Rain was pounding so hard on the roof that it swallowed every other sound. That's probably why I didn't notice the other noise right away. At some point, I started picking up this scraping sound from outside, somewhere along the left wall of the cabin. My first thought was that it had to be a branch dragging across the wood. But I couldn't remember seeing any branches low enough to reach that side of the cabin. While I was still trying to figure that out, I heard two heavy thumps from the porch. That didn't sound like weather. I stood up immediately. I remember freezing in place and staring at some random spot on the wall while trying to listen harder. If someone was moving around out there, the rain would have covered most of it, and that only made me more paranoid. I started thinking maybe the few sounds I had heard were just the only ones loud enough to make it through the storm, and that there had been more before them. My eyes drifted toward the window. I couldn't make myself look through it. If there really was somebody out there, I kept thinking they could just as easily be standing there looking in at me. I stood like that for what felt like a very long time. Eventually, I started to loosen up a little. I told myself I was probably hearing storm debris, or maybe an animal sniffing around outside. I was almost ready to convince myself of that when I heard something that sent all of that comfort straight out of me. Pressure against the door, not knocking, not rattling from wind, actual weight. Like someone on the other side was leaning their full body into it. The wood gave a long creak, and the latch shook once before the pressure lifted. My heart started pounding again, and right then something clicked in my head. If there was a person outside in weather like that, circling the cabin and touching the walls, why weren't they just coming in? The door wasn't locked. Nothing was stopping them. And then I thought about the bracket outside, the screwed shut window, the scratches, the sense of the place. And suddenly the thought that came to me was this: maybe whoever was out there didn't want to come inside. Maybe they wanted me to stay in there. Maybe that was the point. I don't know if that was actually true or if I was just spiraling, but the second that thought hit me, I decided I was done. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I started stuffing my things into my backpack as fast as I could. I had this sick feeling in my gut that something terrible was about to happen, and it did. The next several seconds are still a blur in my memory. I was maybe half a minute from grabbing my pack and getting out when I heard glass explode behind me. I spun around just in time to see something come through the window, and that was all I had time to register before the entire room burst into flames. It happened insanely fast. One second I was standing in a dark cabin, and the next the walls were lit up, and fire was spreading so fast I couldn't process what I was seeing. The heat hit me like a solid object. I lunged for the door, grabbed it, and it wouldn't move. It was jammed from the outside. I threw myself into it as hard as I could. This time it gave. The whole thing came off its hinges and dropped, taking me down with it. I hit the porch hard, scrambled up, and just ran. I couldn't see much of anything. Rain, smoke, darkness, trees. I was crashing through the woods, trying to get as far from that cabin as possible. I didn't even make it a safe distance. Something slammed into me from behind and drove me to the ground. A person landed on top of me, and instantly I knew I was fighting for my life. I was clawing, kicking, trying to twist free, screaming without even realizing it. The guy on top of me was yelling too, wild, almost incoherent. He kept trying to get his arm around my neck. He dug at my eyes. He grabbed my hair and yanked hard enough to make me see flashes. I started getting lightheaded, but somehow I managed to shove him off. The second I got loose, I got back to my feet and ran. Whoever had attacked me was still screaming behind me, completely unhinged. I looked back twice while I was running. I never got a clear look at the person chasing me, but I did see the cabin. It was fully consumed. just a bright, violent fire burning in the middle of the woods. That image never left me. The second time I looked back, the glow was smaller through the trees, but it was still there. I kept moving because, for all I knew, he was still right behind me. I ran until my legs basically gave out. At some point, I found a place where two large fallen trees had collapsed against each other, leaving a narrow gap underneath that blocked most of the rain. I crawled under there and collapsed. I could barely feel my body at that point. I don't know if it was from the heat, the cold rain, the attack, or all three mixed together, but I felt completely numb. All I could do was stay hunched there and focus on breathing. I have no idea how many hours I stayed under those trees. Time stopped making sense. At some point, feelings started to come back into my hands and legs, and I told myself the same thing over and over: move or die. Whoever was out there had to be looking for me, and I couldn't assume he'd gone far. So I got up and started moving again through the woods. I didn't know where the trail was, and at that stage, I didn't care. I just kept going. I honestly can't explain how I made it through that night, but somehow I did. Eventually, I stumbled onto some random trail and followed it. I was soaked, exhausted, and bleeding from more than one place, but I just kept walking. Later, once the rain eased enough for me to see a little better, I was able to get my bearings. I ended up reaching some trailhead I hadn't planned on. By then, the storm had finally passed. After that, my memory gets spotty. What I do remember is that the first person I saw gave me a ride to a hospital. I had second-degree burns on my left forearm and the back of my neck, and the doctors told me I was lucky I hadn't taken in more smoke than I did. Nothing ended up being permanent, but the injuries hurt for a long time. When I finally healed and was back home, I made a promise to myself that I would never go hiking or camping alone again. Somebody set that cabin on fire on purpose. That's the only explanation that has ever made sense to me. It was a thunderstorm pouring rain with a metal roof over that place. A wooden cabin doesn't just erupt like that unless something had been done to make sure it would. I gave the police everything I could, or at least everything I remembered, but I could tell pretty quickly nothing was going to come from it. To be fair, I had been way off in an uncharted section of the forest, so there wasn't much for them to go on. The one thing that still bothers me is the timing. My wife would probably say I stopped doing solo trips because I got older and more responsible, and she wouldn't be completely wrong. But the truth is, I never told her about any of this, and I know for a fact I'll never again go that deep into the woods by myself. My name is James, and this happened around 7 or 8 years ago, back when I was in my early 20s and still doing the kind of stuff I probably had no business doing. I had a friend named Charles who, in our group, was known for always finding places to explore that were clearly off limits. Abandoned buildings, shut down factories, old properties out in the middle of nowhere. If it was somewhere people weren't supposed to go, Charles had probably already found it online and figured out a way in. He spent a weird amount of time digging through Google Earth and those obscure urban exploration forums, and every other week he'd send screenshots into the group chat of some random place he wanted to check out. Most of our friends would talk about it for a few minutes and then never actually go. I was usually the one exception. Charles and I had been close since high school, and I think the reason was simple. We had about the same level of bad judgment when it came to risk. Where most people would hear one of his ideas and immediately say no, I'd usually be asking when we were leaving. That led to a lot of fun memories, but it also led to a few situations that, looking back now, I really don't understand how we walked away from. This was one of those. One weekend, Charles texted me about an old fire lookout tower he'd found somewhere deep in a forest a few hours from us. I wish I could remember the name of the forest, but I can't. According to him, the tower had been decommissioned years earlier and was still out there in the woods, basically forgotten. He never explained exactly how he found it, which was probably for the best. He was convinced we could hike out to it, climb to the top, and spend the night there. I remember being more doubtful than excited at first. Structures like that are usually fenced off, locked up, or at the very least marked in some way. Still, I told him I'd come take a look. And honestly, the idea of being that high up in the middle of a forest with a full view in every direction did sound amazing. So we picked a weekend and went through with it. Charles organized the whole trip, the drive, what we needed to bring, where to park, and how we'd locate the tower once we were in the woods. The drive took about 3 hours, and he told me the hike itself would be off trail, but not too bad, maybe around 4 miles. We left early Friday morning and reached the forest sometime in the afternoon. For some reason, I'd fully expected us to either get lost or never actually find the tower. That's why seeing it through the trees for the first time felt so surreal. I remember blurting something out the second I saw how tall it was. It looked completely out of place standing there in the middle of the woods. When we reached the base, I was even more surprised. There was no fence around it, no warning signs, nothing blocking access. It was just there, like it had been left behind and forgotten. At the top was a small square cab with windows on every side. A metal staircase zigzagged up the frame, and near the top there was a stretch of vertical ladder you had to climb before reaching the cab itself. The whole structure looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. Some of the railings lower down were bent or missing, and there was graffiti on a few of the beams near the bottom. To be honest, it looked like exactly the kind of thing people should not have been climbing. Charles was thrilled. While I was still standing there trying to decide whether I should talk him out of it, he had already started going up. I shouted for him to slow down and watch what he was doing, which at least got him to be a little more careful. After another few seconds of standing there, I told myself to quit overthinking it and followed him. We took our time on the way up, testing the stairs as we went. Most of them held fine, but a few had bolts that were so rusted they shifted when we put weight on them. The worst part was that vertical ladder near the top. It was a straight climb for maybe 20 feet with only a narrow metal cage around it. It was the kind of thing that made my stomach tighten the second I looked up at it. Charles loved that part. He went right up with no problem. Once we reached the top, though, I understood the appeal immediately. The view was unbelievable. You could see for miles in every direction, just endless forest. We'd timed it almost perfectly, too. The sun was maybe an hour from setting, and the original plan had been to stay up there overnight and watch the sunrise in the morning. There was a wraparound platform around the cab, wide enough to sit comfortably, so that's where we stayed at first. We opened a couple beers and just sat there talking while the sun dropped lower. The sky changed fast, going from orange to purple to dark blue, and once the last light was gone, everything below us turned into one giant black mass. There wasn't a single visible light anywhere. The stars, though, were insane. Easily the clearest night sky I'd ever seen. At the same time, being up there in the dark started getting to me. It was hard to explain. I knew there was an entire forest below us, but I couldn't actually see any of it anymore. It just felt wrong, like being suspended over this huge invisible space. Charles noticed I was getting uneasy and started messing with me the way he always did. Little stuff at first, like grabbing my shoulder out of nowhere. Then he smacked his metal water bottle against the side of the tower. The sound that came off that thing was unbelievably loud. It rang out through the steel and echoed through the woods in a way that instantly made my skin crawl. It sounded wrong out there, too big for the silence around us. I actually got mad at him for that. I told him I wanted to go inside the cab, and this time he finally took the hint. The inside of the cab was pretty bare. It had clearly been emptied out a long time ago. He said he was going to stay out for a minute and finish his beer before coming in, which I was fine with. I went into one of the corners and started laying out my sleeping gear. I hadn't even finished when Charles told me, in a low, serious voice that didn't sound like him at all, to come back outside. So I did. I walked over to where he was and saw him pointing diagonally down into the forest. At first, I thought he was messing with me again. Then I saw it. There was a light moving through the trees. It was faint and pretty far away, but there was no question it was there. Seeing it way down in that darkness was instantly unnerving. It was weaving through the woods at what looked like a walking pace, and my first thought was that somebody had heard that metal clang and was coming to investigate. I don't know why I dropped my voice when I spoke, but I did. I remember whispering that he was an idiot and that we were probably about to get caught. Charles looked at me like I'd said something strange. Then he asked if I really thought it was a person. That confused me for a second. I asked him what else it would be. He said the way it was moving didn't look right. It wasn't swaying around the way a flashlight or lantern would if a person were carrying it through the woods. It was too even, too smooth. He wasn't completely wrong, but it was also far away, and I figured distance could explain a lot. I didn't argue with him. We both just kept watching it. Part of me tried to convince myself it was some random hiker or somebody out there for reasons that had nothing to do with us. But even then, I knew I was forcing that idea. After a few minutes, it became obvious the light was getting closer, and the closer it got, the weirder it looked. It moved too steadily, almost like it was gliding. Charles asked me what we should do, and I didn't have an answer. There really wasn't one. We were already up there. It's not like climbing down in the dark felt like the safer option. Then, while we were quietly throwing out explanations, the light suddenly jumped forward, just for a split second. One moment it was moving in that same steady way, and then it seemed to zip ahead unnaturally fast before going right back to its normal pace. It was so brief I almost thought I imagined it, but Charles clearly saw it too. I could feel sweat building in my palms. He looked just as rattled as I felt. I kept trying to tell myself whoever had that light was just wandering around in the woods. But that idea died completely after another 10 minutes or so when it reached the tower. The light stopped directly below us. At that point, I was fully bracing for somebody to call up at us. Maybe security or police or some property owner demanding to know what we were doing. But nothing happened. The light just stayed there, perfectly still, right at the base of the tower. From where we were above it, we could see the light itself, but not whoever or whatever had it. Charles and I stared down at it for a long time. The suspense was unbearable, but apparently it got to him first, because he suddenly did something that made me want to shove him off the platform. He leaned over and called down to it, asking if everything was okay. I stared at him in disbelief. I honestly couldn't believe he had just announced we were up there. There was no answer. The light didn't move either. After waiting a bit, Charles called down a second time. Still nothing. So there we were, around 70 feet up in an abandoned fire tower in the middle of nowhere, with our only way down blocked by someone or something that wouldn't respond. We were stuck. We must have watched that light for at least half an hour. Every now and then we'd whisper to each other, but mostly we just kept staring at it. It never shifted even an inch. By then, I wasn't worried about staying quiet anymore. Charles had already taken care of that. So I finally did something I should have done earlier. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it straight down at the base of the tower. It didn't help. Even with the flashlight pointed right down there, I still couldn't make out what the source of the light actually was. That made no sense to me, but that's exactly how it was. Eventually, we reached a point where there wasn't anything else to do. We tried going back to normal conversation, but I never let myself look away from that light for more than a few seconds at a time. Charles started saying maybe somebody had set some kind of LED there as a prank, but I couldn't understand why anyone would go through the trouble. At one point, he actually suggested climbing down to check it out, and I told him that was completely insane. It wasn't just reckless, it was unbelievably stupid. Then, in the middle of that argument, I looked down and realized the light was gone. Not dimmer, gone. There was nothing below us now except darkness. I scanned the ground around the base of the tower over and over, trying to find it again, but it had disappeared. Charles seemed relieved by that. I was the exact opposite. He kept saying whoever had been there probably left, but now that we couldn't see anything at all, I was even more on edge than before. At least when the light was there, we knew where it was. Now we didn't. The thought that someone could still be down there somewhere and we'd have no way of knowing where they were was what really got to me. Charles tried reassuring me by saying we'd definitely hear anyone climbing up, and logically he was probably right, but that didn't help much. At that point, I didn't want to be sitting out on the open platform anymore. I told him we should stay inside the cab for the rest of the night, and he agreed. So we both went in and set up our sleeping bags. Neither of us had any intention of actually sleeping. That would have felt suicidal. And staying awake turned out to be the right call because maybe 20 minutes after going inside, we started hearing noises. The first ones were metallic hits that rang up through the frame of the tower. I want to be very clear about this because I was specifically listening for footsteps on the stairs, and that wasn't what these were. These sounded more like somebody hitting one of the support beams with something solid, like a wrench or a crowbar. A few minutes later, we heard another sound. This one was slower and uglier. More like metal scraping and grinding against metal. It lasted several seconds before stopping. Charles and I kept looking at each other like one of us was supposed to know what to do, but we were helpless up there. The noises kept happening. What really got to me was that they seemed to come from different places. That suggested movement. Whatever was making them wasn't staying in one spot. The sounds went on and off for a while, and I kept trying to map them in my head, trying to figure out where they were coming from. whether there was more than one source, whether it was getting closer or circling the tower. None of it made sense. We whispered back and forth about what we'd do if we suddenly heard somebody on the stairs. I was sitting against one wall of the cab facing the windows across from me, while Charles was on the opposite side looking over my shoulder. There were so many windows in that little room that neither of us felt safe. We wanted to be able to watch as much of the outside as possible. The problem was, there wasn't much to see. The only light out there was the stars and whatever moonlight was making it through. Most of the glass just reflected darkness. Then I saw something move. A dark shape passed across one of the window panes. For a second, my brain didn't catch up to what I was looking at. Then it crossed in front of the next pane, and that was enough. I yelled without thinking, and Charles scrambled backward away from the window. Both of us rushed to the door and shoved our backs against it. If someone tried to come through that door, they were going to have to force their way through both of us first. I kept looking toward the windows, trying to find the shape again, but I couldn't see anything anymore. That part made no sense to me. Unless whoever it was had dropped down and started crawling, I should have been able to keep seeing them through at least some of those windows. But there was nothing. Just dark glass and our own panic. We stayed like that for a long time. I could hear Charles breathing hard beside me, almost hyperventilating. The next few hours were easily the most tense and miserable hours of my life. We sat there in that exact position like our survival depended on it. By the time the first light of morning started coming in, I was completely drained. When it finally got bright enough to see, I counted to 3 and yanked the door open hard, fully expecting someone to be right there behind it. No one was. Charles and I immediately moved around the outside to check, and the platform was clear. I looked down toward the base of the tower. Nothing there either. We grabbed our stuff right away and started heading down as fast as we could manage. We got maybe 3/4 of the way down before Charles stopped suddenly in front of me. He was frozen on one of the landings, just staring at the next section of stairs. I leaned past him and saw it instantly. A whole section of the staircase was missing. Not a couple loose steps. Not one damaged part. I mean, an entire stretch of stairs just gone. We both stood there staring at it because it genuinely didn't seem possible. Someone had somehow taken apart part of the staircase during the night while we were up above them. That had to be what those noises were. But even that explanation didn't fully work. The sounds had continued after I saw the figure outside the window. So had that person crossed the gap in the dark twice? That didn't seem possible. And there's no way someone could remove that much steel without making way more noise than what we heard. A few clangs and scraping sounds didn't seem like enough. We stood on that landing for a while trying to figure out what to do. In the end, we didn't have much choice. We had to jump the gap. It wasn't huge, but being that high up made it bad enough. Charles went first and twisted his ankle when he landed. I made it across without getting hurt. After that, we got down the rest of the tower as quickly as we could. There was nobody waiting for us at the bottom. In fact, there was nothing there at all. No person, no light. And as far as we could tell, not even the missing metal stairs. At least, we didn't see them. Then again, we also didn't spend much time looking around. None of it made sense, but there was no chance we were staying there any longer to figure it out. I still don't have an explanation for what happened that night. Not for the light, not for the metal sounds coming up through the tower, not for the figure that crossed outside the window, and definitely not for how an entire section of steel staircase could be removed in the middle of the night without us clearly hearing it happen. Every time I see Charles, this still comes up. And the strange part is, even after all of that, I still go camping by myself a few times a year. I've been doing solo trips since I was in my 20s, and I'm in my late 30s now, so by this point, I've got close to 15 years of hiking and camping alone behind me. I know the risks, which is one of the reasons I always carry a rifle. This happened about 2 years ago in the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky. It's a huge stretch of forest, something like over 700,000 acres, and if you know where to go, you can spend days out there without crossing paths with another person. I'd been going through a rough stretch at work, and mentally, I wasn't in a good place. I felt like I needed a few days away from everything, so I drove out there on a Thursday morning, parked at a trailhead off a Forest Service road, and started hiking. The plan was simple: 3 nights in the backcountry, and then head home. That was it. I had my tent, my pack, enough food and water for 4 days, and my .308 bolt-action rifle that I always bring on solo trips. The first day was exactly what I needed. I hiked around 7 miles before finding a flat area near a creek bed that looked like a decent place to camp. I put my tent up, gathered some firewood, and had a fire going by the time the sun started dropping. I cooked some food, drank a beer, and sat by the fire until it burned down low. The whole day, I hadn't seen a single person. I fell asleep around 10 that night. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. I'm not sure what caused it. It wasn't like I heard anything specific. It felt more like my brain just turned back on for no reason, the way it sometimes does when you're sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. I lay there for a minute, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. Then I noticed a faint orange glow coming through the walls. I unzipped the flap and looked outside. Through the trees, maybe 200 yards away, there was a fire. Not a huge one. It looked about the size of a normal campfire, but it was definitely a fire. I could tell by the flickering. I sat there watching it for a few minutes, expecting to hear voices or movement or something that would confirm it was another camper. But I didn't hear anything at all. No talking, no footsteps, nothing. I kept watching, partly because I wanted to make sure it wasn't some kind of forest fire starting up. But it never spread or got larger. It stayed contained, steady, like a normal fire somebody had built. Eventually, I figured it had to be another campsite I just hadn't noticed earlier. That didn't seem impossible, especially since I'd gone to bed fairly early. I assumed whoever it was had already turned in and left their fire burning, which is careless, but not exactly rare. I watched it for another 5 minutes or so, then zipped the tent back up and went back to sleep. At that point, it didn't bother me much. The next morning, it was the first thing I thought about. Not because I was scared of it, but because I was curious. I wanted to see who had been camped nearby, maybe say hello. Mostly, I just wanted to satisfy my curiosity. I packed up my sight and started hiking toward where I'd seen the fire. It took about 10 minutes to get there. I was pretty sure I had the right area. There was a natural clearing that lined up with the angle I'd been looking from the night before, but the second I stepped into it, I stopped. There was nothing there. No fire pit, no rocks arranged in a ring, no ash, no scorched dirt, no blackened wood, nothing. The ground looked completely untouched. I walked the whole clearing, scanning for any sign that someone had been there. There was nothing. No trash, no tracks, no disturbed leaves, nothing at all. The place looked pristine. I stood there for a while, honestly confused. I knew I had seen a fire. I had watched it clearly for at least 5 minutes. It had been right there. But the ground where it should have been looked like nobody had stepped into that clearing in a long time. I did consider that maybe I'd gotten the wrong spot somehow. But there wasn't another clearing nearby at the right distance or angle. Still, there wasn't much else I could do with that, so I moved on. I still had 2 nights left on the trip, and I wasn't about to leave early over something that, at least at that point, just seemed strange. I hiked most of the day. As I moved deeper into the forest, the terrain started changing. The creek bed dropped away behind me, and the ground gradually climbed. By mid-afternoon, I was in a denser, older section of forest where the trees were taller, and the canopy was thick enough to block out most of the sky. It was quieter there, which I liked. The whole place felt older and more still. Around 4 that afternoon, I found another good spot to camp. That evening was completely normal. I let my fire burn down a little after 9 and turned in for the night. I don't know what time it was when the sound woke me, but it ripped me right out of a dead sleep. It was a huge cracking noise somewhere in the distance, like a thick branch snapping, except it kept going. It was violent and drawn out, maybe 3 or 4 seconds long, and at the end of it, there was this deep, heavy impact that I could actually feel through the ground underneath me. I knew right away what it sounded like. A tree had come down somewhere deeper in the woods, or at least a very large part of one had. If you've ever heard a tree fall, which I know most people probably haven't, it's one of those sounds that's impressive and unsettling at the same time. I wouldn't say it frightened me immediately, but the scale of it hit me hard enough that I got an instant rush of adrenaline. I lay there in my sleeping bag trying to work out what could have caused it. The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. There wasn't a storm. There was barely any wind. It was one of those still nights where the woods feel almost sealed off. I couldn't think of any normal reason a tree would come down under those conditions. But there also wasn't anything I could do about it. I couldn't exactly go investigating in the dark. I wasn't going back to sleep though. My heart was pounding too hard for that. So I just stayed there with my eyes closed, waiting for the adrenaline to wear off. Then, less than 10 minutes later, it happened again. Same sound. That same awful crackling, followed by branches crashing and then a hard, heavy thud. Only this one was a lot closer. Not right next to me, but close enough that it hit with a force that was almost disorienting, and it came from a different direction than the first one. The first fall had been somewhere to the south. This one was off to my northwest. I sat up immediately. Now I was actually scared. 2 trees falling in one night in different parts of the forest with no wind and no weather didn't make any sense at all. I kept trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. The most logical idea I had was that maybe the first fall had triggered some kind of chain reaction. But that fell apart as soon as I thought about the directions. These weren't connected. They were separate events. And that was somehow worse. I was sitting there trying to process that when I heard something new. That was the moment my fear went from manageable to full panic. It was this low, continuous rumbling sound. The only way I can describe it is that it sounded halfway between a groan and a growl, almost like a person dragging out the sound of clearing their throat, except it didn't stop. It just continued. It wasn't any animal sound I recognized. I've heard bears. I've heard elk. I've heard bobcats. This wasn't any of those. It sounded deliberate, like whatever was making it meant to be heard. And it went on for what felt like close to a full minute without breaking or changing. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around as quietly as I could, and aimed it at the tent flap. At that point, I was fully panicking. I must have sat there like that for 20 minutes. Eventually, the sound started to fade. It didn't cut off all at once. It just gradually thinned out. Like whatever was making it had moved farther away, and then the woods were quiet again. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night. I don't think I could have, even if I wanted to. It was easily the worst night I've ever spent outside. The second it was light enough to see, I got out of the tent and packed up as fast as I could. I was still badly spooked. Even with daylight in the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. Once everything was packed, I started walking in the direction of the second tree, the closer one. I needed to see it, even if it was just to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I kept the rifle in my hands the whole time. After about 10 minutes, I found it. The tree was massive. The trunk was lying at an angle across a shallow slope, and with broken branches and debris scattered all around it. So it had been real. I hadn't imagined anything. Just seeing it there made my stomach tighten, because some part of me had still been hoping that the sounds in the night had been distorted by sleep. But there it was. And once I was there, I felt like I had to keep looking. I wouldn't have been satisfied leaving without at least trying to understand what had brought it down. I walked toward the stump, which stood maybe 3 feet high. The broken wood was pale and fresh, but the break itself didn't look normal. It wasn't the kind of jagged splintering you'd expect from wind damage or roots giving out. The wood looked torn up. That's the best way I can put it. Parts of the stump looked gouged. There were long, irregular grooves cut through the wood at strange angles, some of them at least an inch deep. It honestly looked less like the tree had snapped and more like it had been worked over, stripped, chewed. The longer I stared at it, the worse it looked. Some of the bark near the base had been peeled away in long strips, and the exposed wood underneath had that same shredded, gouged appearance. I'm not going to pretend I knew what I was looking at, because I didn't. I've seen beaver damage before. This was nothing like that. Beavers leave clean marks. I've seen woodpecker damage too, and it wasn't that either. This was messy, aggressive, and spread across way too much of the trunk to match any animal I could think of. The tree hadn't come down because it was dead. It hadn't come down because of weather. Something had worked on that trunk until it failed. That was the point where I got this really bad feeling in my gut. I needed to leave. I stopped examining the stump and started backing away. Then, as I turned, something near one of the fallen branches caught my eye. There was a small cluster of items on the ground. If they hadn't looked man-made, I probably wouldn't have bothered going over to them. The second I saw what they were, I completely lost it. It was a blue bandana and a carabiner. They were mine. I immediately dropped my eyes to my gear and started digging through my pack. Both of them were missing. That was all I needed. I grabbed everything, shoved what I could into my backpack, and ran. I didn't stop to think about whether running was smart or whether it would make me more noticeable if something really was out there. I just knew I needed to get out of those woods. I ran until the weight of my pack started slowing me down, and after that I kept moving as fast as I could. The hike back took most of the day. The entire time, I felt watched. Not just uneasy, watched. Like something was moving with me through the trees, keeping pace just out of sight. Every few minutes, I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder or scanning between trunks, convinced something was about to come out at me. I kept the rifle in my hands the entire way back. I finally made it to my car around 3 that afternoon. I drove out of there as fast as I could, even though I was exhausted. Once I was a safe distance away, the first thing I did was call the police. I don't think they took me very seriously, but I didn't care. I also knew there probably wasn't much they could actually do, but that didn't matter either. I was shaken up for days afterward. None of it made any real sense. What I couldn't get past was the fact that someone or something had gone through my stuff. Either it had been following me through the forest, or it had known where I was the whole time. That strange fire from the first night had to be connected somehow. I don't believe for a second that it was a coincidence. And those trees. I still have no explanation for them. I genuinely don't think it was a person, but if it wasn't human, then I have no idea what kind of animal could have done it either. I still go camping, believe it or not, but this is one of those things that never really leaves you once it happens.